This presentation will focus on the Old English period and the Anglo-Saxons. This is an introduction to the Anglo-Saxons and their literary traditions. The Anglo-Saxon period. The Anglo-Saxon period is the earliest recorded time period in English history. The period officially begins in 449 when Germanic invaders, primarily from three tribes, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, invaded the then Roman-occupied island of Britannia. Up until that time, the native Britons of Britannia were accustomed to Roman rule, but because the Roman Empire was rapidly losing stability, the area was vulnerable to invaders. The terms Old English and Anglo-Saxon will be used interchangeably in this course. And here is a map of modern Great Britain, which again at the time was known as Britannia. Anglo-Saxon literature. During Anglo-Saxon times, very few people could read. Most stories are passed down through an oral tradition, and scops or minstrels would often sing or recite stories from memory as a part of celebrations and social gatherings. This results in often several versions of stories. The official authors of these stories were unknown, and the Anglo-Saxons followed pagan traditions through the 8th century. Pagans were typically polytheistic, meaning they worshiped many gods. They also had a focus on natural worship or praise of nature. They often had cultic practices as well. The image below you probably recognize. It's an image of Stonehenge in England. It is believed to be a pagan worship site of some sorts. The oral tradition is transcribed. So while their stories were passed down through oral tradition, eventually some of the stories and verse of the Anglo-Saxons were written down. So between the 9th and 11th centuries, Christian monks began writing down the oral stories of the Anglo-Saxons. And the oldest surviving manuscript is Beowulf. Here are some common themes and motifs that you will see in Anglo-Saxon writing. Heroism is a major theme, ideal rulers or kings, the journey, the tribal community, exile would be the contrast to that. There's pagans as well as Christian influences. Another theme that you will see in Anglo-Saxon writing, which tends to be somewhat unique in Anglo to the writing of the Middle Ages, the concept of the ubi sunt. So the ubi sunt in Old English, or in particularly in the Latin, translates to where are they now? And it conveys a sense of nostalgia to those who have gone before. And the whole idea behind it is that there's a sense of doom and an awareness of the finality of life. That is a part of the ubi sunt. So again, specifically it's in the Latin, but you will see it in several Old English texts. So sorry for the clarification there. So the story of Beowulf. So Beowulf marks the beginning of English literature as we know it. It's the oldest surviving manuscript that we have in the English language. It is believed to have been written down at the beginning of the 8th century by a Christian monk in a monastery. So again, it's the earliest known pieces of literature that survives, and it was written in Old English. And so here is a sample of Beowulf, which currently resides in a museum in England. So the literary style of Beowulf. Beowulf is an epic, so it's a long narrative that celebrates the great deeds of a hero and a group of people. The hero embodies the values of society, so very similar to an epic you would see in our own modern tradition. It's written in Old English. In Old English primarily used runic letters and often monosyllabic words. Many of the single syllable words that we use today, like ship and school, for example, come from the Old English. It is also poetic. Beowulf is initially told orally, so many poetic devices are used because remember, it used to be sang aloud by a scop or minstrel. So you'll see alliteration. You'll also see very creative use of language. Three in particular language devices that you'll see is synecdoche, where part is used for a whole, like you might say keel to reference an entire ship. You'll also see metonym, which is substituting a word with its attribute, like you would use the word iron for sword. And then also kenning, which is when you combine or create compound words to poetically replace an other, like you would say railroad for sea. So you will see these various language styles throughout Beowulf and the writing of the Anglo-Saxons. So other literary works from this era. So a couple other literary works that we're going to explore include The Wife's Lament. This is an Anglo-Saxon elegy, which is a poem expressing sorrow, found originally in a manuscript known as the Exeter Book, probably written around the 10th century. We're also going to read The Dream of the Rood. It's an Anglo-Saxon religious poem found originally on a 10th century manuscript, and it celebrates Christ as a hero figure. So it brings in that pagan notion or the Anglo-Saxon notion of a hero, and uses it to tell the story of Christ and the rood or the cross. So as you read the selections in this module, consider how the style and structure of each work conveys the meaning. Consider how each work explores common Anglo-Saxon themes, for example, heroism, the journey, the importance of community, pagan and Christian traditions, as well as the ubi sunt. And consider the impact of these works on modern writing, verse, and culture.